right, friends, we are this morning wrapping up our series, at least part one of our series on revival. And it's an interesting week. We're going to talk about something that we've talked about in a couple of different ways. But it kind of starts really a number of years ago. As I was reflecting on this, actually a bit of this came to me. I got to go on a hike on a mountain with Jacob yesterday, and that was really fun. And I felt like the Lord gave me something to think about as I was hiking. And when I was in youth ministry, many of you know actually that I was in youth ministry for about 10 years, a few years ago, exited that. And one of the books that was really integral in youth ministry at that time, in the early 2000s, was a book called Hurt by Chap Clark. Now, Chap Clark was a youth pastor, and then he ended up being kind of like a researcher of families and systems and all of those kind of things, and how do we really minister to families and equip families in a healthy way. So this book was really significant to me because it opened my eyes up to something that was happening in family systems. And one of those things, as Clark points out, is he calls it the systemic abandonment of youth in our culture. Okay, that was a mouthful, right? Systemic abandonment of youth in our culture. What that means, in simple terms, is that we have learned how to trade good and important things with our kids for busyness. And what it's produced, even while the family stays intact in many ways, what it actually produces is a sense of abandonment within the kids. Okay, so even though the family's together, the generations of kids have learned how to operate as if they weren't together, which is an interesting dynamic, really. And so Clark points out that over time, we've learned how to trade nurture and time with our kids for busyness. And so the relationship goes from having good conversation with each other to driving kids between athletic activities. He calls this the systemic abandonment of youth. And I spent a lot of time trying to equip our parents how to interact with this and how to actually take responsibility within their own families. Now, here's where it gets a little personal. I realized over the last few days that actually I've made the same mistake in my own family already. Like, I got young kids, and I'm already seeing how I've allowed that to happen. It looks a little different. You know, our youngest aren't in athletic activities. Asa is starting to do some stuff, but, you know, we still have a large amount of control. So it's less taking our kids to one point to another and more about how I keep my kids busy. And here's what it looks like more for me, is I've learned that I can have a more convenient life if I plop my kids in front of a device. Yeah, so we're still together, but we're not together. And this is kind of the new systemic abandonment in my own family of my kids. There you go. That's my confession this morning. So I was realizing this, and it's been standing out. Janine and I have had a couple of conversations with less systemic language and more just like, hey, how do we actually reconnect with our kids a little bit? How do we not put them in front of devices as much? And that's a hard thing, actually. If you've already gone that direction, and if you're a parent that has gone in that direction, you know it's a hard battle to get back out, actually. And so we're working on that, because what we've realized is we've made a really bad trade. We made a bad trade for keeping our kids busy and traded out our presence with them, right? So we're not as present with our kids, and the trade is we just keep them busy and distracted. That's a bad trade. I want to tell you about another bad trade that we've made. We've made it in the church. We've made a bad trade in the church, and it's happened over the last 50-ish years. There was a point around the 1970s, 1980s, where the evangelical white church in America saw corporate America around us. We saw the success of business, and there were a whole bunch of new books coming out around business management, how to be a good manager. The idols in the leadership world were these good Fortune 500 managers who were taking companies and transitioning them and helping them to become fruitful again. And so the church in America looked at that and they said, you know what, I think we could actually utilize some information from this. And so they looked at the systems, and they looked at the strategic planning strategies out of businesses, and we started to adopt them. Now, some of those things, we'll just call them tools. Some of those tools we learned from the business world over the last 50 years for the church have not been a bad thing. But here's where the bad trade comes in. What is a bad thing is when we use those tools and trust those tools more than anything else. I think that's the trade we've made. Now here, as we're talking our last Sunday, at least this month, in part one of Revival, each week we've been visiting a mark of revival. This week we visit the presence of God. Here's the bad trade I think we made in the church over the last 50 years. I think we've traded the presence of God among his people for strategies and strategic plans. That's what I think we've done. We've traded the presence of God among his people for some good tools that he could be giving his church. So the question is, how do we actually interact with the presence of God? And how do we actually cultivate this presence of God? How do we do a course correction to address our own bad trade that we've made in the church? I think first it starts with understanding that the presence of God has always been the point. And so I want to invite you to turn with me to Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19. Now at this point, just to set you up a little bit, at this point, God has already visited Moses. He's visited the person Moses in the wilderness, in a burning bush. He's told him, I'm going to send you into the land of Egypt, the place you're fleeing from, and you are going to rescue the Hebrew people, my people, that are in bondage and slavery to the Egyptian people. And so Moses does that. He goes in. He's God's mouthpiece. This is when Charlton Heston comes in and brings all the 10 plagues. And then eventually Pharaoh reluctantly gives up the Israelites, the Hebrew people, and they go into the wilderness. Now it's at this point that we intersect the story, and something significant is about to happen. Something more significant than the plagues. Something more significant than a rock splitting open, which happens just before this passage as well, a rock splitting open and water coming out of it. Something even bigger than that. So in Exodus chapter 19, verse 10 and 11 to begin with, and then we'll skip down to verse 16. And the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today, and tomorrow have them wash their clothes, and be ready for the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Let's skip down to verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended in it on fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. All right, so we have a massively significant moment in the life of God's people. He's brought them out of the land of Egypt, and now he's about to meet with them at Mount Sinai. In verse 10, we read that God speaks to Moses, and he gives him some directions. There's going to be a big moment that's happening, and Moses needs to get the people of God ready for this moment. It's significant, more significant than all of the rest of those events that we just talked about. He tells Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and have them wash their clothes. Consecrate them, set them aside. Reserve them for something that's about to happen. That's what consecration is essentially about. And part of this consecration was going to be they needed to wash their clothes. And apparently it's going to take 2 days for the entire Hebrew people to wash their clothes. Now, parents with kids, you know sometimes it takes 2 days to get through all those clothes. So the people of Israel have to go and wash their clothes. It's going to take them about 2 days to get through all of the cleaning and all of the preparations. And there's a reason for this. Something significant is about to happen, and in verse 11 we read that because on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all his people. Because the Lord's about to be present, something else needs to happen. People need to get ready for his presence. This significant event happening in the Hebrew people needs to be prepared for. And the preparation process is to be consecrated, wash their clothes, and then following this verse, there's actually a couple other instructions that the Lord gives to Moses to help people get ready. No sexual relations, stay pure, all of that good stuff. But the initial part of it is, it's interesting because it's not the same, but it's very similar to what would be happening for people getting ready for a wedding. Two people getting ready for a wedding, they'd get clean, they'd get on their best clothes. They'd set themselves aside. They'd abstain from anything sexually impure. And they'd be ready for this moment of joining together. That's really what would happen in this preparation time for a wedding. And so what we see is almost a glimpse, almost a sense, a hint that what's about to happen is even more significant than the joining in marriage. And the people need to be ready for it. On the third day, after all of that preparation, the Lord is actually going to descend, and the people will see God. That's no small thing. As we jump down to verse 16, we see that on the third morning, they'd consecrated, they'd done what they needed to do. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, and everyone in the camp trembled. Now, we have this moment where the people are getting ready. They don't exactly know what it's going to be like. The people, the Hebrew people, they've seen the power of God. They've seen God's goodness to them. They've seen what happens when you're a Pharaoh and you stand up and you stand against God. They've seen all that. They've seen in the midst of needing provision, just days before this, they needed water, and God instructed Moses on how to make water come out of. They've seen all that water coming out of a rock. They've seen it all. And so they don't really know what to expect, but they know that this is a powerful God that is taking good care of them. They have promises from this God that he is good and he's going to be good to them. And now they get to the third day and they wake up and they go to the mountain, and on this mountain they're hearing all of these sounds. It almost sounds like a natural disaster is taking place in front of them and they're just watching it happen. You know, some of these symptoms of what's going on are almost like volcanic activity, but that's not what happens. You see, part of this is also a trumpet blast. There's no trumpet blasts at volcanic activity. Something significant is happening. The craziest part yet is the Lord hasn't even descended yet. These are just the foretastes. This is just the bits before God actually descends. And their reaction to it is extreme. In verse 16, it says, everyone in camp trembled. Well, yeah. Of course they did. All of this activity is happening. They're anticipating something that they're not quite certain about what's going to happen. And everyone trembled. Biblical scholar Douglas Stewart comments on Israel's trembling by saying, the fact that everyone in the camp trembled reflects not merely the combination of impressive sights and sounds, but the realization of God's impending presence and the dangers associated with it. The dangers associated with it. So catch this. The people have seen God's movement, but now they are coming face to face with just the introduction to God. They haven't even seen God yet. Just the introductory sights and sounds and feelings of his coming presence, his in a moment presence, is terrifying to them. And they start asking questions like, who is this God? We knew he was good. He delivered us from Egypt. But who is this God now? What is he really like? As I was reading this passage, one of the stories that my family loves, actually my wife and I love it more than my kids do, is the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Recently we put some of those stories on in the car over long travels this summer. By long travel, we think anything over an hour is long travel with kids. So amen, yes, I hear you. So we thought it would be great to put on and share with our kids one of the books we love. So we put it on audiobook in the car, and the kids are listening and they fall asleep. Right? I listened to it and I enjoyed it. Everybody else was asleep. I listened to it because it's not safe for me to sleep while I'm driving. But there's a scene in the book that I absolutely love, and there's a bunch of scenes that are actually really noteworthy, a bunch of moments, stories out of it that are really noteworthy. But in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's this moment where the four children are all in the land of Narnia. Edmund has kind of gone to the dark side, if you will. He's with the queen, but he's also kind of been captured. And the other three kids are trying to figure out what this land of Narnia is, and they're trying to locate their brother, and they meet some talking beavers, which just kind of blows their mind. And these beavers end up being the guide to guide them to the person of Aslan, who is a person of renown. And they start kind of catching some of the things that people are saying about Aslan, like there's a white witch in the land, and she's brought a perpetual winter where it's always winter and never Christmas, which tangentially is exactly what Michigan weather is like, okay? It's always winter and never Christmas. Anyway, so they're talking with the beavers, and they're hearing all these stories about Aslan, and they start wondering, what kind of person is this? And so the kids start asking Mr. and Mrs. Beaver about Aslan, and they say, what kind of a man is he? And that's where some really intense and beautiful dialogue happens. They're asking questions about Aslan, and then they are shown that Aslan is actually a lion. Ooh, Susan says, I thought he'd be a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. See, that's what's going through the mind of the Israelites in this moment. Wait, I thought he'd be safety for us. I thought that when we met this God, we were going to feel like all of our troubles had disappeared. But here they stand at the precipice of meeting God, and they're terrified. And they start asking questions about, who is this God? We knew he was good, but he's seeming less and less safe to us. You see, that's what happens when we encounter even the rumblings of the presence of God. That's what happens when we even get near to the presence of God, is we realize that there is something bigger at hand. There is something incredibly intense about God. We see both his goodness and his terrifying nature to us. And that's exactly where the Israelites stood at the base of Mount Sinai, believing that this good God was also terrifying to them, and they trembled. In verse 17, Exodus continues on to say, Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. So they had seen lightning, they had heard a lot of things, they had felt the trembling, they themselves were trembling, and then when they're brought to the actual mountain, they see the smoke. Why was there smoke? Because the Lord descended on it in fire. Now this is not metaphor. This isn't, there was a wildfire on the mountain, and it seemed like the Lord was in that. No, the Lord descended in the fire. That's what this language is. You see, the Israelites were not idiots. I mean, sometimes. But they weren't stupid in how the world worked. They had recognized what a wildfire is. They knew when things were on fire. Moses himself had approached a bush that was burning but wasn't consumed. He knew there was something different about that bush. And as the Israelites look at the mountain of Sinai, they look at it, they see the fire descending on it from above, and they know there is something significantly different. They know that what they heard before and what they saw and what they witnessed has now actually come. The thing that they were expecting is here, and it is more than terrifying. The Lord descended in fire. Not metaphorically, in person. In fact, our scholar Douglas Stewart again says that God has come from heaven to be specifically present on earth. That's what it means here, that God has descended, the Lord has descended in fire. He has come from heaven to be specifically present on earth. Now, heaven is where God dwells. It's not a place that you can walk to or travel to. I used to think, well, maybe we could build a ladder and just get to God. Like, that would be pretty cool. Turns out there's a Bible story about that. Doesn't work out so well, right? You can't actually climb up to God. Heaven is just the place where God dwells. And what we see here is God has momentarily brought heaven to earth And it's terrifying. It's not at all what the Israelites thought it would be. It is overwhelming. But he is here specifically with them. The actual God is present. That's what we need to catch hold of here. The actual God is present. And in this moment, we see something. We learn something about God's intentions with us. And it is that as he has always desired to be specifically present with us. He always has. You can go back to Genesis 1 and you can realize that it was God's presence that dwelled with Adam and Eve in the garden. It wasn't until we broke relationship that we no longer had access to God's presence. It was God that wanted to be present with us each and every day. It was a regular occurrence. But that was broken, and now he finds ways to reintegrate his presence among his people. And so he chooses the people of Israel. He rescues an insignificant nation, and then he shows up to every single one of them. Please catch the significance of this. When the Lord descends in fire, it's the entire nation of Israel that sees it. It is not one eyewitness account. It is not it's not Moses and Aaron. It's not Moses and the leaders. It's the entire nation of Israel sees the Lord. And that's God's intent for us as well, is that each one of us experiences his presence. Not just the leadership of the church, not just the staff of the church, not just the elders of the church. The entire church is meant to experience God's presence. Unfortunately, we don't always respond correctly. If we continue on with the story, we're going to find some things out. So the Lord descends, the smoke billows like a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently as the sound of the trumpet grew louder. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. That's what everybody gets to hear. Moses speaks. How bold is that? Everything is trembling. The fire descends. The Lord descends in the fire on the mountain. And then Moses has the audacity to speak. I think I'd be like shrinking back, awkward moonwalking back into the crowd. You know what I'm saying? Be like, hey guys, did not know this was the plan. Feeling a little bit out of my depth right now. But Moses speaks to the Lord. And the Lord responds. And every single person in Israel hears it. Then after this, if you continue reading on, the Lord speaks. There's a little bit of dialogue between the Lord and Moses. And then God speaks to the entire nation of Israel and speaks out what we call the 10 Commands. In Hebrew, it's literally 10 words. God speaks 10 words to them, and it's 10 words about how to be in relationship with him. So they experience God, and then they receive the instructions about what it's like to be in a relationship with this kind of God. What does it take to be in relationship with a God that is both good and scares everything out of you? All sense of life and audacity out of it. What is it like to be? What does it take to be in relationship with that God? God says, here's just a few principles. Here's how I want you to interact with me. Here's how I want you to interact with others. All right? That's what the Holy God required out of the people. But please also catch in there the order. God doesn't give people the 10 words and then show himself to them as if they've earned it in some way. God shows up to every single one of his people and then says, now I'm going to show you how to be in right relationship with me. This is how I want you to respond. This is what I want you to do. Following that, if we skip on down to Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 and 19, we catch the back end of this. After God's done speaking, verse 18 says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. The author, Moses, really wants us to know this was a scary and intense moment. They trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die. This is the turning point. This is the bad trade Israel made. They had the presence of God. He showed up to all of them. That was the intent of God. And then Israel hears it. They see it. They're terrified and they back off. And they chose instead to abdicate the authority God was giving an entire nation of people to represent him down to Moses and the leaders of Israel. They abdicated their role. They rejected the presence of God among them. They said, it's too scary. We can't do this. We're going to die. That's what it feels like when the presence of God comes on you. It feels like death sometimes, like a really, really good death. And their response to this moment was, Moses, you go talk to God. If we talk to him, or if he talks to us, we're going to die. And they stepped back. They walked away from the presence of God. In fact, you'll see this story time and time again. I think, even in the church today, that there are moments where we intellectually agree with the understanding that we want God's presence with us. But somewhere in the back of our minds, we know it's also terrifying, and we're not sure we're going to respond appropriately. I think there's other times that maybe if we're being honest, we have seen the presence of God in our lives, and we know we haven't responded appropriately. We've chosen to ignore it, or we've looked at it and said, you know what? I'm going to let you deal with that one. I'm going to go this way. There's an undeniable fact, though, for Israel here that something significant has happened. Whether they choose to respond appropriately or not, they have been terrified by the presence of God. You see, I think sometimes we talk about the fear of the Lord in this reverential awe sort of way, like, hey, be respectful of the Lord. Fear of the Lord actually means being afraid of the Lord. It really does. When the people were afraid of the Lord, it was because they saw him, he revealed himself, and that's a terrifying moment. They didn't know what to do, and they responded poorly. All throughout the days of revival, the presence of God has been a mainstay in every single one. You see, just as God provided his presence in Genesis 1, we rejected it. Just as he has provided his presence in Exodus 19, and we rejected it. Again and again throughout history, these moments come where he wants to reveal himself to every single one of his people. He wants to show up, and he wants to be responded to appropriately. It's happened in every revival. One of the main, central, most significant marks of every single revival throughout history is the presence of God. Last week, Janine shared a little bit about a 1904 Welsh revival. Some significant things happened, and it was so significant that it actually changed the course of the church for almost the entire world for a century. There's more that happened in the midst of the Welsh revival that is just flooring, though. One of the pastors of that time, his name is R.B. Jones. He watched what was going on as he was pastoring, and he was part of the revival. And this isn't going to be up on the screen for you. I just want you to listen to this. R.B. Jones, a renowned Welsh preacher during the revival times, wrote down in his journal what he witnessed as the presence of God showed up in the Welsh revival. He wrote this: "A sense of the Lord's presence was everywhere. It pervaded, nay, it created the spiritual atmosphere. It mattered not where one went, the consciousness of the reality and nearness of God followed. Felt, of course, in revival gatherings, it was by no means confined to them. It was also felt in homes, on streets, in the mines and factories, in the schools, yea, and even in the theaters and drinking saloons. The strange result was that wherever people gathered, it became a place of awe, and the places of amusement and carousal or revelry were practically emptied. The pit bottoms and galleries became places of praise and prayer." That's what happened when the presence of God showed up and people responded appropriately. All of these things shifted. I love that when the presence of God shows up in true revival, it doesn't just show up to the leadership. It's not one person going back up to the mountain and bringing down the word from God. That's not what God's intent is. God's intent is that each and every one of you hear from and experience God on your own. That we collectively hear from and experience God together. That's what marks every revival, and it's not contained just to a Sunday morning. It goes into your houses. That means your households, your families are going to be touched by the presence of God. But it doesn't even stay in the homes. It goes out onto the streets. It goes into the fields. It goes into the workplaces. The presence of God permeates everything in times of revival. Friends, that's what we want. That's what we wait for. That's what we yearn for. That's what we desire. Here's the truth, though, in all of this, whether we're reading about 1904 revival or whether we're reading out of Exodus chapter 19 and 20, here's the truth. The presence of the Lord revives us, but we have to respond. We must respond. We must respond appropriately. The presence of God revives us, but we must respond to it. It is something that requires a response out of us. And we can choose to respond the way people did in the Welsh revival and give all of ourselves to it, or we can choose to respond and make a bad trade once again and say, no, leadership of the church, we're going to settle for your strategies. We're going to settle for your management. We're going to settle for your hierarchical structures. You see, the presence of the Lord will revive us. But the response, that's up to us. Here's what I believe. I believe that we are on the edge of true revival. I mean, historically, as we look at timelines and periods, there seems to be some kind of a pattern to how often revival happens. When we look at that, we're on the edge. When we look at other leading indicators of what happened before revival, society that seems to be devolving and losing any sense of God's presence, that's when God shows up. Friends, that's where we are now. I do believe that we are, the American church is on the edge of true revival. Not because we're so great, but because we need it so badly. We need it so badly. We've made a bad trade, and God is ready to fix that for us. He's ready to bring his presence back, to replace the tools that we've elevated above him. And we want to be ready. We want to be ready to respond to God appropriately. And there's a few ways that I want to ask you to join me this week in preparing yourselves for the actual presence of God. And before I do that, I just want to say, I'm not claiming to stand up here and say personally that I have had an experience with the Lord the way Israel did. I've never seen fire descend from the mountain. I haven't experienced the presence of the Lord the way that the people of the Welsh revival did. But what I am telling you is this is what I see in Scripture. And this is what I see throughout history as God moves among his people. And there are some things we can do together to get ready. And as we said, each and every week, one of the most simple things we can do is pray. Okay, I know that sounds simplistic, but that's the first thing I want to ask you to do this week, every single day, is I want to ask you to pray for God's presence daily. Pray for God's presence daily. I think that if we're entering into and asking God for his presence, that is something he will honor. That is something he will do on our behalf. That is something he will respond to. Just as Moses stood at the edge of the mountain and he speaks to the Lord, you and I have the opportunity to stand at the mountain and make requests on behalf of God's people. And you can know that this is a prayer that God will answer because it's something he wants. You have to look at his pattern. His goal has always been for his presence to be with his people. The problem isn't God's unwillingness to give his presence. The problem is if you look at our pattern throughout history, we usually reject his presence when it comes. So it's on us again. Our part in this is to pray for God's presence. And I'm asking you this week, at least this week, to let your hearts be burdened for God's presence. Not just for you, although that's cool, for us. And not just in here, but that his presence would go into homes and into workplaces, into every other area of society, that people would experience it, that people would feel it, that people would be overcome by it, and that they would be brought to the point of needing to respond either in fear and trembling and rejecting or entering in and letting him have his way. That's what I want you to ask. And now, sometimes, I know, I grew up in the church. I've been through it myself. It is very easy for us to pray prayers like this. Lord, if it is your will, would you do whatever you want to? I mean, I grew up hearing God can do what he wants when he wants. Of course I believe he can do it. I just don't know if he wants to. I want to tell you this morning, you can pray boldly for God's presence because he actually does want to do it. And we can argue about this all day long, but one of us then is reading our Bible and seeing what God wants to do. It's all throughout it. You can open up your own Bibles and see that the presence of God has always been with his people. In fact, as we see in the book of Revelation, the goal isn't to whisk us away from a broken world and take us to heaven. It's to bring a new heaven on earth. What does that represent? It represents God's presence among us. That was the beginning and the end. And it's everything in between. So you can boldly pray, Lord, bring your presence. We give into it. We want it. We desire it. We're sorry for rejecting it in the past. We need it again. Would you come revive us, Lord, with your presence? It's his presence. That is the mark of every single true revival. So ask daily for God's presence. The next thing I want you to do in preparation, and this is a big ask, okay? As soon as I explain it, you're gonna be like, well, that's no small task, right? I wanna ask you to start practicing the presence of God. I want to ask you to start practicing the presence of God. And what I mean by this is something very specific. There was a guy in the early 1600s. He was a monk. He lived in a monastery, and his name was Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. Pretty dope name, okay? Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. He was a monk in a monastery. He washed dishes, and he had a limp. He considered himself to be the least of all the brothers in the monastery. But he did this one thing, and he wrote a lot about it. He wrote a lot of letters about it, and that's how we know about it. He did something he called constant prayer, continual prayer. Another way he referred to it was simply practicing the presence of God. And he developed this awareness of God. He developed this communication with God that was ongoing and constant. He read in the Bible these simple words of pray without ceasing. And he went about it quite seriously. He understood that there would be something significant in that if he could figure out what that looked like, he might be ready for the manifest presence of God. And so he set about doing it, and he wrote about it. And he wrote this. Brother Lawrence said, in order to know God, we must think about him often. Once we get to know him, we will think about him even more, because where our treasure is, there also is our heart. See, here's the thing. If we could leave that quote up there for just a second. I'm not asking you to have a constant dialogue with the Lord. I think that's impossible. If you've grown up in the church and you read Paul's words, pray without ceasing, and you tried that for even one day, you'll realize that constantly talking to God, it's impossible. Okay? That's not what Brother Lawrence is instructing us to do. When Brother Lawrence says, pray without ceasing, or when he lived out Paul's words of prayer without ceasing, he's really talking about practicing the presence. And as he defines that, it's really about being aware of God's presence. It's about thinking about him, understanding that as we practice thinking about God with us each and every moment, his reality will become our reality. We will realize that he is present in each and every moment. And so Brother Lawrence, as he was thinking about God, he would take each moment that he had throughout the day, and if he was washing dishes, he would wash dishes with the Lord. And as he was thinking, he would think his thoughts, but he would think them toward the Lord. As he was peeling potatoes, he would will that God was in his hands helping him peel potatoes. He peeled potatoes literally by the grace of God. As he wrote his letters, he would pretend that God was willing his hand to write the letters. This is how he developed and cultivated an awareness of the presence of God. And I think, friends, our church, the church, needs to start practicing the presence. Because if we can be faithful in those little moments of learning how to practice the presence of God, like Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, when true revival hits us, we'll know how to respond appropriately. We have to be prepared. Just as the Israelites consecrated themselves for 2 days, you and I need to consecrate ourselves and prepare for the presence of God. And one of the ways we can do that is by practicing his presence in our everyday lives. Think toward him, feel toward him. As you're filling out spreadsheets, let the Lord be with you as you hit the keys on the keyboard. As you create things, let the Lord be with you as you create. Let him inspire your creativity. As you're in meetings, let the Lord be in that meeting and lift it up to him before. Let him give you wisdom in the meeting. Let everything be a moment with the Lord. You see, the truth is it's never you and another person in a meeting. It's always you and another person in the Lord. And we have to practice that awareness in order to be ready for it. It got so intense for Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection that in their monastery they had set aside 3 days for intentional prayer together communally. They would maybe sing a psalm, read a hymn. They would do a number of things that were set out ahead of time. But Brother Lawrence remarked in one of his letters to a friend, he said, you know what, I actually, this is my interpretation of Brother Lawrence, just FYI, it's not a direct quote. I find these moments a real pain now. Because my mind is so set on the Lord, somebody else is inviting me into a different moment. So even moments dedicated to prayer with everybody else became a pain to Brother Lawrence because he felt like it robbed him from being in the presence of God. That type of life is possible if we're willing to practice. And Brother Lawrence was not even in a time, even in a moment of true revival. I want to ask you for one more thing. I want to ask you to be aware of where God's presence already is. And what I mean by that is don't miss your experience. Okay? Don't miss your experience. I think sometimes it's so easy for us to be looking around and looking for where the presence of God is that we miss where God already is. I think we can look at what God is doing in somebody else's life, become jealous of what God is doing in somebody else's life, and not realize what he's doing in our own lives. I think it is possible that God is working in your life right now, and you and I aren't even aware of it because we're not looking for God's presence in our lives. We get so infatuated with what God did over there or what he's doing over there that we forget and miss what he's doing here. You see, it's normal for us. Don't miss your experience with God. I want to tell you what I mean a little bit by that. If Janine and I waited for our experience with the Lord to be just like everybody else's, we'd totally miss what God does in our own lives. We've seen God work in powerful ways where people have been pushed down and overwhelmed by the presence of God, but we never have been. We would love that. It hasn't happened yet. But what has happened is we've bathed our houses that we've had in various locations over the years, and we've asked that God's presence would be tangible in it. And then one day we realized something was happening. And it happens with Janine. It doesn't happen as much with me. But people would come into our house. And we'd have people over for kind of dinner or hanging out or whatever. And then I'd notice, especially the new people that weren't Christians. This is the truth. The new people that weren't Christians that would come into our house and share food with us. I'd be talking with the husband, and then Janine would walk off with the wife somewhere. And I'm like, well, where the heck did they go? And we come back together, and I'm like, what happened? She was like, we just met, right? Yeah. She just told me everything about her entire life. And afterward, they would almost hands down always say something like, I wasn't expecting to say that. We're like, we know. We've seen it as a pattern because we expect the presence of God in our lives. We expect the presence of God in our house. We expect that when people come in, they will experience the presence of God in our house. And so what other people see, and maybe they don't understand, maybe they're missing it as well, but how God works in us and how we experience his presence is our house tends to be, and it's better when the kids are asleep, a place of peace and a place of safety, a place where people can be unburdened and share. That's how our experience of God's presence is. Don't miss your experience of God's presence. It may not be a house of peace like that. It may be something else. You have to be aware of how God's grace is on you uniquely for yourself and others to experience his presence. Don't miss your experience. Can we do that this week? I think if we do that, we are going to position ourselves for when true revival comes, we will respond appropriately. I think when true revival comes and we experience the presence of God, we will give into it. We will allow ourselves to be overcome. You see, when the presence of God came in the Welsh revival, it was so intense, and it was going everywhere, that people were laid out in the streets. They said it looked like a river of black because everybody was dressed in black for some reason. I don't know why, what was going on in the fashion of the day. Everybody was dressed in black, and it was just a sea of black because they were all laid out under the presence of God. People in the fields, working the fields, not even having anything to do with the revival gatherings, were laid out in the field, waking up hours later, only understanding that they had an experience with God. We need to be ready to respond to that. Let's do this, okay? Let's pray.